Thank you very much, Ginger. Thank you very much, fellow UNA members. Thank you, students from colleges and universities around the region. Next month, we commemorate, I would hesitate to use the word celebrate, the 10th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, ordered by President Bush and endorsed by the U.S. Congress. That invasion had seemed to put the future of the UN Charter architecture for international peace and security in doubt. Indeed, Secretary General Kofi Annan that fall said that that invasion, quote, represents a fundamental challenge to the principles on which, however imperfectly, world peace and stability have rested for the last 58 years, end quote. That Iraq invasion was conceived as one kind of solution to a stubborn conflict. If anything, that one exacerbated the conflict. American politics have taken a sharp turn from that high noon of unilateralism 10 years ago, but we should not be lulled by the very internationalist orientation of the Obama administration into thinking that Washington's embrace of the UN rules of the game is now permanent. Vigilance is required of us. And there are voices, including those that were dominant in the debate 10 years ago on the invasion of Iraq, that are pointing to the persistence of stubborn conflicts as evidence that the United Nations remains a failed guarantor of peace. For all that development and environment and jobs and global economy mean to the real future of humankind, the fact is that it is on peace and security that the American political debate judges the usefulness of the United Nations. So we conclude today's program with this panel on a major subset of maintenance of international peace and security, namely resolving stubborn conflicts. We have a superb panel to inform our discussion. Their biographies are in the programs that you have. From the heart of the Security Council, we have France's permanent representative to the UN, Gérard Araud. From the press corps that closely follows the UN, especially for the volatile Middle East, Raghida Dergham, who in addition to being diplomatic correspondents for Al-Hayat, meaning life, a Middle East daily, is the founding executive director of the Beirut Institute, and from the Department of Political Affairs, well, it's not Antonella Caruso with the sex change. So put aside that biography. It is Jehangir Khan, the deputy, who has had a long and distinguished career in the United Nations. So I have to summarize this briefly for you. He's the Deputy Director for Middle East and West Asia, which, if you hadn't known, happens to be where the most headline-grabbing conflicts of the world have been bubbling up for the past couple decades, had served as chairman of the UN Iraq Operations Group, had been deputy chief of UN policy planning. And before joining the United Nations, back in 1992, he worked on the staff as political advisor to the ambassador of Saudi Arabia. So he has a sense for the mysterious ways in which the desert kingdom there orients itself in international affairs. Over 30 years experience in the multilateral diplomacy, a graduate of the Fletcher School of Diplomacy at Tufts University, which redeems as having gotten his undergraduate degree at London University, and hailing from Pakistan, which explains his grand entry just as we were beginning. So if we can begin, and this we're going to conduct not with opening speeches, but as a kind of, initially, a roundtable question and answer from within the panel, and then we presumably will have seated you with questions, ideas for questions that you will then pop to this distinguished panel. And let me begin fittingly with the heart of the Security Council, the beating heart. does France, and who will disprove everything you've heard about the French, Ambassador Araud. The political unrest, Ambassador Araud, across the Arab world, what's been sometimes maybe misleadingly called the Arab Spring, has spawned enough violent conflict, as opposed to just peaceful transfer of power, as to draw the international community in to help some of them. UN's been involved in a protracted political transition in Yemen. Saudi Arabia sent troops into Bahrain to crush democracy protesters. The Security Council invoked responsibility to protect, which Jan Eliasson mentioned this morning, to authorize international military intervention in Libya. And 2 years of bloody conflict in Syria have taken the lives of 60,000 Syrians. What accounts, Ambassador Araud, for the very different reactions taken by the Council in these different situations, all of which seem to bubble from the same Arab revolutionary impulse? In particular, what kind of shadow has that Libya experience cast over the Council's efforts to deal with Syria?
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. Well, I guess behind the questions which have just been raised is the issue of the double standard. You know, you always hear about double standard to a point that when you hear this word, you don't even think of it. You know, you consider it, its meaning is obvious. Actually, no, it's not obvious. You know, what is policy? Policy is not what you want. Policy, foreign policy, is what you can. And all the work of a diplomat or a diplomacy is to try to have what you can and what you want, you know, in a sense, have a sort of common ground. It happens or it doesn't happen. In Libya, it happened. We wanted something and we could do something. Why? First, for political reasons. You know, the UN, the military intervention was requested by the Arab League, which was the sub-regional organization. It was requested, military intervention. It was accepted by the African members of the Security Council. So and to be frank, nobody wanted to defend Gaddafi. Gaddafi was the perfect evil guy. So, in a sense, we went to a vote to the Security Council to authorize the military intervention, and it was not a triumph. You know, it was 10 votes for it. You know that the majority, the requested majority was 9. We got 10 votes, and the Russians and the Chinese, who could have cast their veto, abstained. So the difference, I guess, between Libya and Syria first is that when we tried 3 times to go to the Security Council, that Russia and China didn't abstain and voted against it. We had a majority, a large majority, but they cast a veto against the intervention. So we don't have, in Syria, we don't have the legal basis that we had in Libya. You know, it's really the first thing. Politically and in military terms, there was not even a debate that Libya was not a challenge for the French and the British forces, because there were mainly French and British planes supported by Danish planes, I guess, Canadian planes. It was not a real challenge because the Libyan military capabilities were simply, you know, close to non-existing. So, you know, you have also to look at the reality. You know, if you ask the French or the British to die or to risk the life of their soldiers for a cause which is basically not the vital self-defense of your own country, so you do it only if, frankly, the risks are minimal. And also they were minimal in Libya, to the point that actually we didn't lose a plane. In Syria, it will be different. Oh, the Syrian military capabilities are totally overstated by the press, but nevertheless, you know, really, for instance, you have seen that the Israelis have been able to enter the Syrian airspace twice in 2 years without losing a plane. You know, really, while people are saying that their air defense is fantastic. Actually, it doesn't look that fantastic. But nevertheless, you can consider that Syria will be certainly more difficult if there was an air intervention. And politically, we don't have a request by the Arab League, the sub-regional organization. Again, the Arab League didn't come to the Security Council to say you should allow a military intervention. So in a sense, we don't have for the basis that we had. We could go to Libya, and there was a sense of emergency. There is certainly a sense of emergency, and I guess even more serious after more than 60,000 casualties. But simply, we don't have the legal basis. Militarily, it will be quite more difficult. So immediately, people are saying, that's the result of Libya. If in Syria, no way. It has. Frankly, the only difference between Syria and Libya is that the Russians abstained on the first one and didn't abstain on the second one. It's not because of Libya. It's simply because Russia and China, but especially Russia, decided that its vital interests are at stake in Syria, while they were not in Libya. And you can understand why. Because it's very important in foreign policy never to caricature the foreign policy of a country, even if you disagree with it. But from a Russian point of view, you can argue that Russia has major interest in Syria. It has had a very long relationship with Syria for the last 50 years, in every sense of a relationship: intelligence, military, weapons, but also strategic. We have discovered that there were between 30,000 and 50,000 Russians living in Syria, which says a lot, actually, about the intensity of the relationship between the two countries. And there is also the sense, when President Putin met I think it was last June, my president, the Prime Minister of UK, and after that the President of US, he said more or less the same thing. He said, look at the Arab world. If we are not wedded to Assad, but if Assad falls, it will be the Islamists who will take the power, and for us, it's a major threat. So basically, the Russians have decided to back Assad, and it's not because of Libya. It's simply because they have decided that their major national interest is either to keep Assad, or at least to try to get a regime which will not be an Islamist regime. And of course, nobody can guarantee that when Assad falls, the successor regime will not be an Islamist regime. And actually, more the time it's what we have tried to tell the Russians, more the time is running and more the danger is of having an Islamist regime. So that's the first thing that we have to think, forget this expression of double standard. Its policy is what you can and not what, unfortunately, not only what you want. In some places we can and we want and we can. Other places it's more difficult, and Syria is a good example. And second element is the military solution, which is the most spectacular way of solving the problem. Is certainly not the most effective way. It's an effective way of solving the problems. And we knew it since we opposed the Iraqi war in 2003. We'll be able to discuss Mali later on, but frankly, it's not our first choice. And Mali, the military intervention in Mali, was certainly not our first choice. The political solution is certainly the best one. And that's the reason why in Yemen, the Security Council has supported the political solution, whatever you can think of this political solution. There are problems, there are bumps, hurdles, but in a sense, it's better than a civil war. And you can say also in Bahrain, again, it's not double standard, it's simply that you look at what you can, you consider that there is a political crisis in this kingdom, and you are trying to see how you can help to get a solution there. And it's very easy to say you should do that and that, But basically, nobody is going to invade Bahrain. Nobody is going to impose sanctions on Bahrain. So the best way for us, for all of us, is to have a political dialogue with the authority of Bahrain, so that we can, we can move forward and avoid the worst. That's also a second lesson in foreign policy. The foreign policy is not trying to get the best solution, is to try to avoid the worst disaster. So once you have really reduced your expectations to what I've said, really first do what you can and not what you want. Secondly, try to avoid the worst thing. I guess when you look at the foreign policy you'll be, I guess, more optimistic about the results that we are getting.
Thank you, Ambassador Araud, for making us feel more optimistic about the results we've been getting. We'll now turn to Jehangir Khan, who will be able to tell us a bit about those results that it's like watching perhaps paint dry in the sense of why we don't yet appreciate what we should be optimistic about. The UN and your department had first deputed Kofi Annan, now Lakhdar Brahimi, to try to shut down this Syrian conflict through a political settlement process, as Ambassador Araud was convincingly arguing was the way you were going to, in the end, get this settled. But they've been frustrated, both of them, by discord among the Permanent Five and maybe some other states in the region that I don't need to name, and probably you'd be too shy to name, particularly over the sequencing of a transition and possible application of coercive measures. But really, would this much vaunted P5 unanimity, if you had it, be able to force these now deeply entrenched and furiously hating each other Syrian factions to be able to go along on the path to political compromise? And what's the role of these neighboring states, Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and are they really on board this non-moving train of a UN political process?
Thanks very much, Jeff. I think the question is, of course, the question in terms of how we are positioned right now with regard to the Syria conflict. I think Ambassador Araud has, I think, in a very articulate way, put forward the realpolitik, if you will, of what is doable or what can be done, and the need to approach the diplomacy of the Syria conflict through that optic. If I can take that a bit further, I think we have to recognize that the Syria conflict now has been going on for almost 2 years. A lot of bloodshed, a lot of people, great humanitarian catastrophe, and those of us who know Syria, the beautiful country of Syria, the wonderful people of Syria, it is really a great tragedy that is unfolding in front of us. Speaking as one who has worked directly on the Iraq crisis for many years, it pains all of us to see yet another country being swallowed by internecine internal conflict, which the international community is finding hugely difficult to address. Now, if I may, in our sort of articulating the challenge before us, there are really, and these are the challenges that face the diplomacy for both Kofi Annan and also for Lakhdar Brahimi, who are two of the ablest diplomats that we have, who have huge diplomatic experience, huge political goodwill, and as Lakhdar Brahimi often likes to say, that individually every member state of the Security Council and beyond supports him. The challenge for him is to get all of them to support him together. And that remains a challenge. He was just here last week, and I think he got everybody to individually support him, but he didn't yet get the Council to collectively support him, even through, let alone a resolution, a sort of tepid press statement. And why is that? I think Ambassador Araud has, as I said, indicated the sort of realpolitik of it. But if I may, there are really three fault lines that are affecting the scope or the potential or the political space, as we like to say, for diplomacy to really gain traction. First of all, there's the fault line running internally through Syria itself. It's an obvious fault line. It's between the government on the one side and their supporters internally. And we shouldn't forget that the government does have supporters. They might be a dwindling lot, but there is a constituency there. And then you have, on the other side of the fault line internally, there's, of course, the rather disparate opposition that is beginning to get its act together. You know, they've formed themselves into a coalition, but they still are a rather heterogeneous, not homogeneous, coalition, a group who have a sort of broad vision of where they want to go. In other words, democracy, rule of law, human rights, etc., but are not entirely agreed on how they want to get there. And then, of course, in addition to the politics of that fault line, there's the military side, which Ambassador Araud also highlighted. There's the fact that both sides believe still, whether they are right or wrong, they still believe that a military solution is the best way. They both believe, perhaps misguidedly, that one or the other will ultimately, underline the word ultimately, prevail. And that the correlation of forces is such that one or the other will eventually collapse and surrender. Well, that's their point of view, and in fact, that's how we see the ground reality. And hence this fault line, in terms of the diplomacy, when on the one hand, the parties themselves still believe that they can fight it out, and on the other hand, you have Lakhdar Brahimi or Kofi Annan or the Secretary General of the United Nations or the Security Council or eminent ambassadors like Ambassador Araud and others trying to push for a political solution. It's so hard when the parties don't have the political will. They jaw about a political solution, but in reality are still fighting through the sword. So that's the fault line that we are facing internally. Then, of course, as Jeff Laurenti has pointed out, there are the regional neighbors. There's the fault line running through the region itself. You have, on the one hand, a number of important regional neighbors of Syria, all of whom have, if I may say so, different axes to grind, which have perhaps less to do with Syria, but have, so it's not so much about the situation inside Syria. It's, as Ambassador Brahimi has said to the Security Council last week, it's about Syria and what goes on around it. And here you have, for example, on the one side, Iran and a number of other countries that remain very supportive of the government. And on the other hand, you have a number of Gulf countries and Turkey, etc., that are similarly have a are sympathetic to the opposition, are supportive of the opposition. And so there is still, I would say, that the region remains fairly polarized, and that's the word polarization, both internally and in the region. And that's another fault line that Lakhdar Brahimi is trying to bridge. And there are some glimmerings of movement on that recently, and I'll mention that in passing shortly. And then finally, and most importantly, or not less importantly, of course, is the fault line running through the international community, as is most eminently reflected in the Security Council itself. You know that there have been several vetoes, Russia and China, double veto, which is relatively unprecedented in the modern history of the UN, resolutions that were vetoed, and the Security Council has still not completely recovered from those vetoes. And the dialogue in the Security Council still is not a true dialogue between the different members of the Council, particularly amongst the P5, but unfortunately it seems to be that the dialogue is a dialogue past each other, if I may say so, with all due respect. And that has also complicated the life for Ambassador Brahimi. As I said, he is given the support individually but not collectively. And the Council has not yet been able to move beyond that fundamental fault line that exists. And so the challenge really for diplomacy, for Lakhdar Brahimi and before him, for Kofi Annan, is how to bridge each of these divides. It's not possible to move, unfortunately, on one, i.e., for example, at the national level, without also having the regional actors and the international community, and particularly the P5 and the Security Council, also to be genuinely supportive, and underline the word genuinely supportive, of a political solution. And at this time, you know, the realpolitik still seems that the parties on the ground and some of their supporters outside are continuing to fund and arm them, and hence fueling the conflict from the outside, whilst at the same time playing token lip service to the notion of a political solution and a diplomatic settlement. And that can only go so far. And that is where, in fact, right now, Ambassador Brahimi has taken a number of steps. He has had efforts to bring the United States and Russia together in a tripartite format. He has engaged the P5. And, you know, he will continue to plug away. But ultimately, the political will still has to be mobilized at each of these three levels before we really get traction. And that is really the nature of the challenge that we face. Thank you.
Thank you, Jehangir. Now, Raghida, you're the diplomatic correspondent for Al-Hayat, but you don't have to be diplomatic. So, unlike our other two presenters. So, what do you, with a keen appreciation of who's who in the region, what do you see as the fundamental interests that Jehangir has pointed to within Syria, among the other parties in neighboring countries? We haven't mentioned Israel yet, certainly Iran and the rest. In fact, is this a proxy war for the Israel-Iran conflict that orients perhaps Washington and others? And I hope that our panel will be feel free as we go forward in the next round to start interrupting each other and correcting each other. But we will respect your rights to say this uninterrupted.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jeff. Thanks for including me in this panel. Diplomatically speaking, as you know, I write a weekly column in which I'm least accused of being diplomatic. And yes, the Security Council right now has become party to the conflict in Syria by being unable to deliver anything on Syria. 2 years ago, there were demonstrations. There were peaceful demonstrations. That's when the government decided to opt for the military option. Now we go back to say about what is it, the political option or the military option. That's what happened 2 years ago. 60, 70,000 people dead later. And we're talking now back and forth. Oh, do we go to the political? Well, those who want the military, they have something up their sleeves. Yeah, everybody has something up their sleeves. Syria has become the arena for proxy wars, not only one. On the international level, I would say that there is a Russian-American element there in terms of who wants to sort of, get what out of Syria. Ambassador Araud rightly said that the Russians saw in Syria a very important stake for them, whether it is the Tartus base or whether it is the role of Russia in the Middle East altogether. It beats me to see how they think they could have done this and gotten themselves a better foothold in the region by alienating a very big majority of those who don't think that the Russian role in Syria is productive. And secondly, by really making sure that the very Islamists, the extreme Islamists that they didn't want in Syria are now not only strong in Syria because it's 2 years later with the prolonged conflict, but in fact, they are really angry with Russia in particular. I don't see how Moscow saw this in its own interest. In the region in the past, you would see most of the Arabs blaming the United States for everything. And they still do. But now Russia became a partner in the blame, if you will, because of the policies that the Russians have pursued. So what I want to say is that in answer to Jeff's question, and as far as the regional proxy war actors, if you will, yes, Iran is a direct party in this war in Syria. I mean, Iran is helping militarily, and there is, in fact, this would be in defiance of a Security Council resolution by under Chapter 7, by which Iran is not allowed to lend military help outside its borders, and all members of the Security Council, no one brought that to the table to really sort of, have a confrontation there. Why? Because three double vetoes later are very effective in making the rest of the Security Council members be afraid to go for the fourth. I mean, I understand that this is a necessary calculation amongst powers, especially the 5 permanent members, but on one hand, the Russians and the Chinese succeeded in neutralizing the role of the Security Council, but on the other hand, the Western members on the Security Council enhanced that neutralization of the Security Council by being very, very afraid of going to the fourth double veto. Mind you, of course, then when it came to Mali, it was much easier to get the Russians and to allow military intervention than in Syria. But on the other hand, there has been another sort of model of not waiting for the Security Council to give you a resolution, but to have sort of the legitimization of action, such as what happened in Kosovo, without having to go back to the Security Council when there were so many dead and when there were so many atrocities. What do Iran and the Gulf Council, the GCC is the Gulf Council Cooperation, which has 6 members, as you all know, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, what I'm forgetting, Oman, and UAE. Now, obviously, we all know that there has been a very big competition or war for ideas. I mean, war, maybe in some case, it could be a competition between the 2 sects of Islam, but it's really more than that, and that is the Iran-Saudi battle in the region. It is Iran-Syria, Iran-Israel on the nuclear, but it's Iran-Saudi Arabia in as far as the regional role that Iran would like to have in the Arab arena. So it's a very complicated matter there, but yes, Syria happened to be the arena, and at least at one point it was considered that if you really want to weaken Iran, both on the nuclear and on the hegemonistic ambitions of Iran, you just have to sort of like make sure that they get leaner in Syria. I mean, you do Syria, you get Iran, but it seems that the administration in Washington did not want that. So while I'm not saying that the Obama administration is as responsible as the government of Vladimir Putin in behind what's happening in Syria, I'm not putting them on equal footing, but I am saying both have contributed to what we are witnessing now, which is a war of exhaustion. I mean, it seems that a couple of things that the Americans and the Russians have in common is to somehow let this war go on to exhaust each other, each of the players, whether it's the extremist Islamists from the point of view of Russia, but maybe from the United States point of view, well, let the Qaeda types and the regime types sort of, have this war of attrition and eliminate each other, exhaust each other. I think the trouble with that, and it's a huge trouble, is that the tragedy of Syria, the tragedy of the Syrians. We are talking about that many thousand dead and displaced. So I don't think that the more time you take and it's okay, things are not, they could have been worse. I think they are quite bad. And they are quite bad and will get worse when they go outside of the borders of Syria. But they are very bad internally. And I think, that the international community, it behooves the international community not to be party to this civil war as a de facto situation because of its inability to deliver, although the Security Council is in charge of international peace and security. Was that diplomatic enough?
Now, suitably beyond the diplomatic, I think, to help charge the conversation a bit. I'm going to ask if we can have somewhat shorter interventions in the next 1 or 2 rounds of questions so that we can get to the rest of our participants here. And so let me begin this round with Jehangir and ask Ambassador Araud and Raghida if you will comment on this particular issue before we pick up the next one. And that's Israel-Palestine. It's been a peace process in deepest of deep freezes for the past 4 years. Palestinians just have gone to the UN for observer state status. The quartet that once made some kind of faint music has been silent. And perhaps it's already disbanded. With the disillusionment with a seemingly vain peace process that you see on every side, are there any ways to get this moving? Or is this something that, as one of the American presidential candidates suggested last year, you may as well just kick down the road because you can't affect it? I'm going to ask Raghida after Jehangir takes off.
Thank you very much, Jeff. That's the billion-dollar question, not the million-dollar question, of course, that you ask. And of course, you know, as we focus on Syria and other regional situations, we should absolutely not lose sight, as you quite rightly point out, of the deep, deep diplomatic freeze in regard to the so-called peace process. And I say so-called because a friend of mine recently said that what we need in the Middle East, and come talk about Middle East peace processes, drop the word process and just get to the peace, because, you know, for all these years, we have been so much involved in process and not enough political will generated for peace. Now, it might sound a bit of an oxymoron, but the fact is that my first point in trying to address this question is that nobody can want peace more than the parties themselves. You know, we cannot, as the United Nations or the United States or France, whoever, I mean, I dare not speak for those countries, but impose a peace from the outside. There have been many efforts by outside mediators, foremost, of course, which has been the United States. Jeff Laurenti mentioned the quartet, which is the United States, Russia, the European Union, and the United Nations acting in concert. They have tried at least to keep the Israelis and the Palestinians engaged in terms of dialogue. But in terms of result, I'm afraid we can all see that the situation is in tatters, that the political stalemate, and in particular the plight of the Palestinians, is not improving. And you have also, of course, a very difficult situation amongst the Palestinians themselves. You have a bifurcation between Gaza and the West Bank, between Fatah and Hamas, but not just Hamas. You have other groups such as Islamic Jihad. On the Israeli side, you have just elections that have just taken place. There is a new government in the process of being formed. There is some hope that perhaps there might be new political will coming out of Israel and perhaps from the Palestinians, who in turn are trying to reconcile and form a more broader and a more unified stance. But the bottom line remains that a lot of homework still has to be done by the parties themselves. You know, the irony is that the solution to the Arab-Israeli and the Palestinian-Israeli is very much known. We all know what, in the end, would be the contours of the solution. It's not. Okay, let me just conclude. It's not. You know, it's not a mystery. It's really the issue of how you get there, and I'll pass that on to Raghida.
Yes, Raghida, if you pick up, yes, and maybe has the Arab world lost interest in this with all of its own internal convulsions?
No, the Arab world has not lost interest, but it's not the only priority. It's not the only thing that's on their plate now. And this actually, Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, is rather upset with that, because they didn't want the Arab Spring to, you know, to take away their focus on shaming the Arabs because of Palestine. Because it was very important to go on shaming the Arabs. Look what you've done nothing, you've delivered nothing on Palestine, look what you are. And so then when the Arab public turned into addressing its own issues, Really, this was not to the liking of Iran. But let me just say the contours and the situation. The contours of a solution, of course, you're absolutely right. There are clear 67 borders with minor exchange in between the Israelis and the Palestinians in making sure that there's two states living side by side in peace. It's a two-state solution, but that has not seen the light despite Security Council resolutions, despite quartet meetings, despite all of that. Because, you know why? Because quite honestly, I don't think that there has been enough pressure on both sides, of both sides. And above all, I don't think there has been pressure on the Israeli governments, from the US in particular, on the Israeli government to take it, really. If I were an Israeli, I would pocket that option of a two-state solution. So what do we have right now? President Obama is coming in the second term, and a lot of people are telling him, don't go there. You went for it the first time around, your hands, your fingers were burned, just don't pick it up again. It's a hot potato, leave it. And then others are saying, the Europeans are going to be coming now to Washington in the next couple of months, and they're going to say, no, we want you to lead on the Palestinian issue. Mind you, the Europeans can play their own role instead of sort of, handing it to the Americans only, and because they do have the tools with both the Palestinians and the Israelis, whether it is sanctions or whether it's aid. So then the final thing I want to say is that the new development is that we have a situation now with Palestine as a non-member state at the United Nations, which is a new reality. That reality gives the Palestinians the potential to be party to their own statute and then take the issue of occupation, issue of settlements to court, as in its capacity that they will charge this is war again, war crime, and therefore then they will put the settlements and the occupation on trial. Of course, the Americans will just absolutely, leave the Palestinian Authority hanging. They will cut all aid, but then you will say, what alternative might they have for a two-state solution? If the settlements go on, there will be no two-state solution. Think of it, because these settlements eliminate the option of two-state. What options do they have?
I think you've sown some seeds for the Q&A that will follow, Raghida. Ambassador Araud, on this subject, Raghida has just suggested that you Europeans are just fading into the woodwork and not picking up what you're supposed to do and deferring too much to Washington. What about that? What about this state status? Does it change anything?
No, first, I disagree with Raghida about pressure on Israel. It won't work. It won't work because Israelis will not cave in under pressure, and it won't work because the Americans will not be able to put significant pressure on Israel in any way because of the Congress. So we have to give up this dream that the Arab world has about putting pressure on Israel. Well, even again, you want, you can, you cannot. So let's find another policy. Basically both sides are unable to go to peace by themselves. I don't have a lot of time, but both sides, on one side, the status quo is comfortable. On the other side, there are two enemies. You can't ask the Israelis to sign peace with half of their enemy. They have a good point. So basically, they are unable to go to peace by themselves. We know what will be peace, as Jehangir Khan has said, we know. So I think nothing will be possible if the Arabs, the Americans, and Europeans are not, moving together and trying, really to bring to the negotiation the Israelis and the Palestinians. You have to convince the Israelis that they have an advantage to go to peace. You have to understand that for Israel, for the moment, to go, in a sense, to go to peace is to run a risk. To have a Palestinian state in the West Bank, try to imagine if the Qassam rockets were falling from the West Bank on Ben Gurion Airport. The country will be closed. It will be the end of the economy of Israeli economy. So you have also, you have to look at the problem from both sides. So the Arabs have to convince Israel that if there is a peace, Israel will be a full member of the Middle East. The Europeans have to offer, also have to offer something. For instance, on the refugee problem, on the refugee camp, and the Americans also. So again, if the international community is not going to step in a sense, the conflict is solved. It's solved on the basis of the status quo. And I agree with Raghida, it means that in 2 years, the two-state solution is dead. Because of the settlement policy, it will be impossible for any Israeli government to give up the West Bank. So we have, ahead of us, we have 2 years. And if we don't do the job, we, Arabs, Americans, Europeans, it will be too late. And the Arab-Israeli conflict will remain what it is, which means a low-intensity conflict without solution.
A bracing reminder of stubbornness of conflicts. Ambassador Araud, let me now pick up another subject to which you had alluded in your first intervention, and that was Mali, where France decided last month it couldn't wait for an interminably slow Security Council process to authorize a West African force to intervene in Mali, as the situation was quickly operating to the disadvantage of the Bamako authorities. What are the prospects for this military intervention in the longer term? You had said that a political settlement and process is crucial. How much appetite is there in the Security Council for yet another expensive peacekeeping operation in Africa?
No, first, the military intervention was not our first choice, because with the French, we had tabled 3 resolutions on Mali, the last one being 2085, the 20th of December. And all the logic of our policy was to have a political process for reconciliation between the Malians, and at the end of this process between the northern part of Mali and southern part of Mali, at the end, which means in 6 months, 1 year, you would have had the Malian army supported by an African force, to restore the territorial integrity of Mali. So it was a long process and mainly a political process. On the 9th of January, suddenly, the armed groups have launched an offensive, and suddenly we realized that between the armed groups around Al-Qaeda and the capital of Mali, Bamako, there was one soldier left. So we were obliged to intervene. And frankly, we were not particularly keen on doing it, and especially the new French government, the new French authorities elected in May, can't be suspected of being very keen on military intervention in Africa. So we are obliged to go there, and we'll go to the end, which means that we really want to get rid of these terrorist groups in Mali. So far, so good. I guess that we will remain as long as it's necessary, but we want to leave as soon as possible. And so if things are running smoothly, it means that in a few weeks, we'll ask the Security Council to approve the creation of a UN peacekeeping operation in Mali under Blue Helmet. So the idea is very clear, and it's after this, I should say, high-intensity fighting phase, we'll go to a UN peacekeeping operation with contingents which will be mainly Africans. And it will be also, not only there will be a peacekeeping operation for the stabilization of the situation, but there will be also a political process, because in a sense, we have not forgotten that the basic problem in Mali is a political problem, that the armed groups have taken advantage of the long-term grievances of some parts of the Malian population. So we need a new national Republican pact in Mali, a new negotiation which is not only between the North and the South, but which is on Mali. So our scenario, our best case scenario will be in a few weeks, creation of a peacekeeping operation under Blue Helmet with a special representative which will be in charge of defending the human rights, but also to push for a process of national reconciliation in Mali.
Thank you, Ambassador Araud. Any other comments on Mali here? Okay. Then the last issue I want to raise to engage the panel on before turning it over to you is the one that strangely appeared almost not at all in last year's American presidential campaign, even though we had nearly 100,000 troops there. And it's not obviously the Iran nuclear program, it's the war in Afghanistan. So, Raghida, let me ask you to kind of begin this discussion. Have we been hearing too much happy talk about how the Afghan government is now able to stand on its own 2 feet, is able to survive the planned withdrawal of Western forces? Is Afghanistan now such a forgotten backwater that it doesn't really matter what happens there once the NATO force in Afghanistan is gone?
I'll address Afghanistan first, and then I'll turn quickly to the issue of Iran nuclear program. In Afghanistan, there are some Americans, some in the United States say when NATO withdraws from Afghanistan, it's going to be really Russia's problem because there will be regrouping and regathering of the extremists, of the Taliban-like, of the whatever you want to call them, jihadists. They will regroup not only in Afghanistan, they would really then sort of take the revenge from the Russian policy in Syria all the way in the Caucasus, maybe all the way into Russia. Now they have, on the other hand, some in Russia say, well, after NATO withdraws from Afghanistan, what we're going to have is the reemergence of a Taliban or the Islamists or the jihadists or whatever you want to call them. And guess who's going to pay the big price first? It's going to be the United States because they're going first into Pakistan. Think about it for a moment. I guess they both agree that there will be a reemergence of the extremists. They will have another lease of life, if you will. Why would we, why is there a withdrawal right now? I guess I understand for internal politics. I think the President of the United States made it clear he wants to withdraw from areas of conflicts, although it's very clear to me that the war, whether you want to call it the war against terror, the war against violence, terrorism, whatever you want to call it, it goes on. And I think this is where Russia would like to also become partner with the United States on this, this fight, the Islamists, the jihadists, but that would be the covert operations rather than policy. Now, as far as the other part of what do we do about it in terms, I understood from sources, and again, this is, I don't know if this is absolutely, I know it was put on the table. I don't know if it had been reciprocated, and we don't know what happened in Munich in this last round of talks between the Russians and the Americans, and, with the Syrians and the Iranians, they were all there. But the point is this. President Obama made a promise during the elections. He said he would not allow Iran to become a nuclear country. Now, he could just somehow dance around that promise, and 4 years later, somebody else will inherit it, or he could just have, he would need the ladder to climb down from that promise. It seems that the Russians are saying, I'll offer you that platter. I will, we will influence the Tehran mullahs. We will influence them to freeze, because that's all they're talking about, freeze the program. But you just got to turn a blind eye a bit on what's happening in Syria. So in a way, there will be a sort of like a trade-off. The Iranian nuclear program or the Iranian ambition for hegemony in the region. So it's sort of like one will be sort of held back a bit, the other one will be leashed out, and vice versa. And I don't know if President Obama has accepted that. All I know is that they are having new talks about, restarting for a new beginning in the relationship. What's the trade-off? Where are they going to be collaborating? Is it gonna, Syria is gonna be important, but is Syria gonna be, again, another arena for the sort of who gets what on a bilateral relationship at the level of the United States and Russia?
Thank you, Raghida. Ambassador Araud, on Afghanistan, you guys have left militarily. What are the prospects as the rest of the Western countries leave for being able to sustain political support back in capitals to at least keep writing checks to keep this government in Kabul afloat? Does it really matter? Is this something that folks now in Europe see as really no longer central to international security?
I think they have never considered it was central to international security. Basically, that's a problem. Basically, for the Europeans, Afghanistan, but the UK for historical reasons, because the UK is used, in a sense, to fight in Afghanistan with the result we know. But for the other countries, to be frank, for the other European countries, it has really, considering Afghanistan as a major threat, is a bit far-fetched. And we went there, I guess, most of us, we went there to show our solidarity with the US after 9/11, you know, basically. And that's the problem, is that when you look at the polls, they've always shown that the support to the military presence in Germany or in the Netherlands or in France has always been very minimal. It's always their governments which have, you know, really supported the intervention in Afghanistan, you know. And at some moments it became politically unsustainable. You know, it became the case before France. It became the case in Canada because of the casualties after, I guess, a major accident. It became the case in Spain, Poland. You know, basically, little by little, you know, really governments had to accept, you know, the decision of their public opinion. We are democratically elected governments, after all. So in any case, now we are living, everybody is living, but there will be a sustained political effort to promote reconciliation between the Afghans. Situation is improving between Afghanistan and Pakistan, and I guess it will be to the Afghans to settle their own problems with the countries of the region. I agree with Raghida, what she has just said. It's also to the Russia, the China. You know, they're on the front line. And, you know, it's very funny because in Security Council, my Russian colleague is trying to, every time we are voting a resolution on Afghanistan, of saying, you know, and NATO will not be allowed to leave Afghanistan without being allowed by the Security Council. You know, really. Of course, we are fighting for Russia, so really, why not? That's a good point. So again, on Iran, because I totally disagree with Raghida on what she has, her idea. I think, you know, Russia can't deliver Iran. You know, we have been negotiating for the last 10 years. And the Russians have tried desperately to convince the Iranians, you know, to freeze or to make a move. You know, as you can guess, their president there, Putin, went there, their minister went several times, their political directors went 20 times, and they were ready to take anything, any nod for a yes. And actually, they didn't get anything for the last 10 years. The Iranians have simply not even started to negotiate. You know, and they are not going to negotiate with the Russians. The Iranians, when they negotiate, if they negotiate, they will negotiate with the real guy in the room, which is the US, you know, really. So the political decision has not been taken in Tehran so far to negotiate. And I don't know if it will be if the decision will be taken. And on Syria, well, we are not in the Cold War. The Americans and the Russians can't deliver Syria, even if they agree tomorrow. Let's say that America and Russia agree tomorrow. What will happen? Nothing. Simply nothing, because the people are fighting. That the people on the ground who will decide the fate of Syria. Usually, the fighters, you know, and it's not Russia and China. And I do think that Lakhdar Brahimi was making a mistake by really considering that Russia and the US were the key of the conflict. The key of the conflict, they are the people on the ground. The Syrians themselves will decide the fate of Syria.
Ambassador, just a quick question. Don't you think if the Russian position changed towards Syria by lifting the veto, wouldn't that make a difference? You don't think that's going to make a difference?
They will not change. They can't change their position.
You mean the Russians will not? Yes, I agree with that. But if they had, If they would, then
but
that
you
does
can't.
change. You're saying that this does not change things on the ground. Yes, it does, because once you have the, you have the international community making clear that this is not, it's roadmap, then the fighters on the ground know what's happening the next day. I mean, and I want to say just one other thing. This was not really my idea. I'm not promoting the idea of that, of that exchange. I said it was reported to be a Russian idea, so please let the record reflect that.
Okay, we're going to go to Jehangir for the last word on the Afghanistan question. I would ask if folks want to ask questions that you begin now coming to the microphones. You've heard, Jehangir, what the eminent political analyst in the press corps has analyzed in terms of Afghanistan, what the eminent ambassador from France, that's you, right, has said in reply. Soon the UN mission in Afghanistan, with all the foreign troops running for the exits, may be the last international presence of any influence, such as it is, left in Kabul. What influence can something like UNAMA, the UN assistance mission in Afghanistan, have to try to maintain women's rights and in a traditionally deeply misogynistic society? What kind of influence can it exert to keep the elections next year more or less honest and credible? Whether the UN, as the United States and those that had been in solidarity with it, take off?
Well, I think that we have to learn from the lessons of recent history of Afghanistan, and I hope very much, having heard to Ambassador Araud and Raghida also, I think that Afghanistan might not be central to the international security interests of major powers, but this is to their peril. And I say this in a very constructive spirit because we all know that whenever there has been foreign military intervention, where was the Soviet military intervention, a very brutal occupation that eventually was negotiated, the withdrawal from the United Nations, through the United Nations in 1988, the Geneva Peace Accords, that what came after that was a horrendous civil war. Afghanistan was, quote unquote, forgotten. There were millions of refugees in Iran and Pakistan, and what came after that? The Taliban, Al-Qaeda, 9/11, the change of world history. So I would still submit to you, ironically, if you were to read global history, the pivot of world history somehow also is in Afghanistan. And that is simply by its geopolitical location. The fact that it is in that crossroads geographically. And I think we need to think very hard about that lesson. In fact, what one gathers when you talk about the future of UNAMA, the UNAMA and the United Nations engagement is a reflection of the international community's continued commitment, and I hope it will not be lip service, but for real, because what we see, notwithstanding the efforts to reconcile between Iran, Afghanistan, and its neighbors, is that all its neighbors, while paying lip service to the idea of peace and reconciliation in Afghanistan, at the same time are also preparing for the next civil war in Afghanistan, for the next regional conflict over Afghanistan. And just as in Syria, as we see the lip service to diplomacy and at the same time the continued effort at the military solution, so in Afghanistan we see preparations for that. So it is absolutely fundamental that as the foreign forces withdraw from Afghanistan, that the emphasis on a political solution, on the elections that are coming, on national reconciliation, that Afghanistan should not just be seen as a turn-on, turn-off type of a situation. I think the consistent engagement of the international community through UNAMA and through international assistance will remain fundamental, not only for the future of Afghanistan, but also for the stability of the region. We have seen so much come out of Afghanistan affecting this region, all the way now, you could argue, up to the Sahel. And I think that the danger of blowback is still there. So, when it comes to issues such as women's rights, of course, this is part of the overall picture that either one can move the compass forward and all the hard work that has gone in, all the resources that have been spent in Afghanistan, all the strides that have been made with regard to women's issues, for example, that those are not lost because suddenly Afghanistan is no longer hot or sexy, if I may say so. I think it's very important that we remain engaged.
Well, there, Ambassador Araud, we're now told that Afghanistan is the pivot of world history. Yeah. So a somewhat different perspective than that which you had just articulated.
From Europe and from Asia.
A Pakistani would see it as the pivot, right? And as Jehangir suggested, there may be an inexhaustible appetite for conflict. The French and the English, after all, had fought a 100 years war. So we're only a third of the way into that in Afghanistan, 2 times.